Ladies and gentlemen, the Executive Director of the Becket Fund, Kristina Arriaga.
Woo! Hello, Denver. The camera does add 10 pounds. Just want to remind everyone of that factoid. It's so good to be here, so good to be in the heartland. I come from the desert that is Washington, D.C. I feel good here. Maybe it's the altitude, but I feel really good here. I'd like to start by thanking President Bill Armstrong, who had the foresight and courage to join a lawsuit against the Affordable Care Act when few others would. Thank you. His courage made others join a very important fight for American freedom. Thank you. I'm also really happy to be the warm-up act for my good friend Eric Metaxas. He's a terrific speaker. In fact, one of the few conditions, the only condition I gave Jeff Hunt was that I could not speak after Eric Metaxas because he's so good. If you have not purchased his books, you must bring up your smartphone after I'm done speaking and order them. Great, inspiring reading for the summer. Although I must say, some of you know he wrote a book called 7 Men, just came out with a book called 7 Women. And you know, he could have made it about 8 women and include me, his good friend. Well, but we're all called to forgiveness, so do buy his books. My name is Kristina Arriaga. I'm the executive director of a small public interest law firm in Washington, D.C. called the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. We were named, oh, thank you. I have fans here. We were named after Thomas à Becket, who was martyred because he refused to allow the king to interfere in church's business. We believe that every single human being is born with his eyes on the far horizon. We believe we're thirsty for the truth and the transcendent, and we believe that the government cannot intrude in that search. We believe that religion is a good, that it's part of our nature just like culture and art, and it should be expressed in society. We do not believe that religion is like secondhand smoke and no one should be exposed to it. Sadly, over the last 20 years, we have been really busy protecting the rights of ministries and churches to operate without government intrusion. In the last 20 years, we have handled over 170 cases. We have won 90% of them. That's a good thing. In the last 5 years alone, we have been before the Supreme Court 5 times. 5 times, when it was something truly unnecessary. You may have heard about some of our Supreme Court cases. Hobby Lobby, the Little Sisters of the Poor. Who's familiar with the Hobby Lobby stores? I hope so, yes. So you may know the Green family started their business out of a garage with a $600 loan, and they built it into an arts and crafts chain with 30,000 employees, and they have stores in 48 states. The Greens are a devout Christian family, and as a result, the stores are closed on Sunday. They play Christian music. There are no lewd cards in their merchandise, and they felt a Christian obligation to give their employees twice the minimum wage. Yeah, good summer job. Great people. So when the Affordable Care Act was passed, the government told the Green family that they had to supply 20 FDA-approved contraceptives. The Green family said, we don't have a problem with 16 of them, but we are opposed to 4 of them because these are drugs that the government itself admits may cause an abortion, and we are a pro-life family. The government said, no problem. We will fine you $1.6 million per day if you do not provide these 4 abortion-causing drugs to your employees. So the Greens put everything in the Lord's hands and went to court and battled in court for several years until they got to the Supreme Court, and we won their case 5-4. You may know the Little Sisters of the Poor. They have a home here in Denver that is a small order of Catholic nuns that tend to the elderly until God calls them to himself. They take care of 13,000 elderly around the world. These are people that have no family or have been abandoned by their family or are too poor to go into hospice care. The Little Sisters were subject to something called the Health and Human Services mandate, the same mandate that was applied to the Green family. And the government told them, you know, you have to provide these drugs to your employees. And the sisters, surprise, said, no, we won't do this. Over the course of 2 years, the government exempted Pepsi, Visa, Exxon, the largest employer in the world. The military was exempted from having to abide by this mandate. They changed the same regulation 9 times. They exempted their own program for the disabled. In fact, 1 out of 3 Americans do not have a health insurance that is subject to this mandate. They refused to exempt the Little Sisters. So they had to go all the way to the Supreme Court, where the government mocked their case and told the sisters they were chasing after invisible dragons. They said this in court. Luckily, even though Justice Scalia had passed away, we went to the Supreme Court with their case, and just last month, the Supreme Court told the government they had to go back and work on a solution that worked for the government and also worked for the sisters. My purpose here today is to remind you of something you already know, that our rights do not come from the government, therefore the government cannot take them away. But the government is growing and growing and growing, and as a result, it's smothering our rights. In fact, very soon, the government may be sitting at your kitchen table, telling you what you can believe, what you can say, and what you can teach your own children. It sounds like a big exaggeration, and I don't blame you for a moment for not believing it. First of all, you hear my accent. I'm Cuban American. We Cubans are prone to exaggeration. But secondly, it sounds almost fictional. I would like to offer a short bit of historical perspective. My father was a rich man in Cuba in the 1950s, and he had to escape Fidel Castro's Cuba. He arrived to the United States with no possessions. My mother is German. She spent some time in a concentration camp in Germany. We all ended up in exile in the beautiful, hot, Spanish-speaking US territory of Puerto Rico. My dad took the only job he could find. This lawyer, who was once a successful businessman, took a job as a door-to-door salesman of vacuum cleaners. Nothing was beneath him, and he was happy to have the job. My mother stayed at home, taking care of the 3 of us. We grew up without many material possessions. In fact, objectively, we were poor. I took my first job at 12 to help the family with the grocery bills, but I had no idea we were poor. In fact, I feel rich. I feel rich partly because every night we sat at this 1950s Formica dented table that we had under the one window in our kitchen. My father would tell us the most incredible story. He would tell us that unlike Cuba, we lived in a country where we could do anything. Unlike Cuba, even I, a Latina woman with an accent, all I had to do was work hard and get an education, and we could achieve anything. This was magical to us. No one needed the Magic Kingdom. We lived in it. He told us that in this country, the government could not touch what was in our minds or in our heart, unlike Cuba. In Cuba, all the rights come from the state. In Cuba, there's the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution on every block. And your neighbor can go into your house and sit at your kitchen table and ask you what you think, what you're reading, what your opinion is. And the price is pretty high. You can go to prison, you can get executed. In contrast, my father would tell us, we could even criticize the President of the United States himself. And there we would enjoy, in this country, we would enjoy this freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, tell this to your children. Don't forget this is a most exceptional country. I grew up with a tremendous appreciation for freedom. And my first job when I graduated from college was to work for a Cuban man who had been in prison for 22 years. And he spent 8 of those years naked and in solitary confinement, covered in urine and excrement that was flung at him by the guards who were making sure he stayed in prison and did not violate what the Castro government wanted him to do. After he was released, I told him, how did you endure them? I asked him, how did you endure them? And he said, because I was never alone, God was in every corner of my cell. For me to have sided with Castro, yes, good for him. For me to have betrayed my own conscience and side with Castro would have been a spiritual suicide. The second refugee that I want to tell you about that I worked with those years was a pilot. For those in aviation, this was a MiG pilot, a military pilot in Cuba, and he was so thirsty for American freedom, even though he had never experienced it, he took his MiG and he defected and he came to the United States, but he left his family behind. And he thought naively that the Cuban government would release his family. In effect, in retaliation, his family was held hostage under house arrest in Cuba. We campaigned for his release, their release, and after a while he came to me and said, I can't stand it. I'd like your organization to buy me an airplane, and I'm going to fly it into Cuba, pick up my family, and come back. I was 27 years old. It sounded like a great idea. My 51-year-old self looks back at that moment and think, how many things could have gone wrong? So we bought him an airplane, and we got him a map at the map store in Washington, D.C. We sent people ahead, we planned their rescue, and lo and behold, one afternoon in December, we flew to a key of the coast of Florida, to a private airport, and he took off. And I was there with a walkie-talkie waiting for him to come back with his family. And I was hoping the US government would not be too interested in details associated with how they got into the country. Walkie-talkie millennials, it's before cell phones. Sure enough, about 30 minutes later, I heard the crackling of the walkie-talkie, and he said, I bring a plane full of love. He had rescued his family from a roadside in Cuba, his wife and his 2 children. Now, it was a big secret, and I had not even told my family, so I called them from a payphone, and my family, knowing I'm a little bit of an exaggerator, they're like, nah, it didn't happen. There's no way. So they didn't believe me. I'm a little hurt until it appeared in People magazine and Vanity Fair and Reader's Digest. This man so thirsty for freedom, he flew a plane to Cuba. They were the grand marshals of the Walt Disney Parade that year. Almost 30 years after my father told me these stories at that dented Formica kitchen table, I find myself telling my own children about this great country of ours. But we're getting distracted, and we don't think certain things can happen here. We're being foolish if that happens. For a time, we Americans watched in horror what happened in the Soviet Union or in Cuba, and we thought that was so far away. But it has become very real. Just 3 years ago, a German family of homeschoolers had to seek asylum in the United States because they were Christian homeschoolers. The German government said that they would take custody away. This is not Soviet Union, this is Germany. In the United Kingdom, if you are a Christian family, you're a Christian couple, you are bigots and therefore you cannot adopt children. And now in the United States, the very basics have been challenged. We at the Becket Fund have had to defend the Pledge of Allegiance 4 times already in the last 20 years. The Pledge of Allegiance is voluntary, no kid has to say it, and there is a group of activist atheists that want to silence the children who want to voluntarily say it. The US government thinks it has the final say in protecting kids. And if you don't believe me, get this. A Yale law professor very recently wrote, an essential part of long-term reform of American family law should include overruling that parents have a right to the custody of their own children. Really? Parents cannot raise their own children? We at the Becket Fund see this reflected in new healthcare laws. Just last month, all hospitals received a regulation from the Health and Human Services saying that if they perform mastectomies and hysterectomies for medical need, they must also perform them for individuals wanting to undergo sex change surgeries that may also include children, even if the doctor objected to this procedure. A Catholic hospital has already been sued because they refuse to cover these services. The Affordable Care Act treats 11-year-old girls as adults. When you're 11, many insurance companies will send you, your daughter, a letter saying you are now able to obtain the week after pill without parental consent and without having to pay for it because there's no copay. Your parents don't need to know. Contraception, abortion, sexual orientation, all really difficult, complex, important topics that should be decided at the kitchen table with your parents, not in Washington, D.C. by some government bureaucrat. However, things are dire, but not always lost. Many of my conservative friends allow Eeyore to become a god in their lives. We at Becket are optimistic. We have an unfair advantage. We are right. Fight back. Don't let anyone silence you or shame you or say your identity is not valid because they disagree with you or because it's offensive. Good grief. We were meant to offend each other in this country. We're meant to have a robust debate. Let's face it, left alone to our own thinking, we're basically morons. If we're not exchanging ideas with each other, if we're not having the debates in colleges and universities, we're not challenging each other's beliefs, what are we doing? Yeah. People think that things start in Washington. They don't. They don't. They don't start in Washington. They just end up in Washington like a big garbage bag. They start here, in the heartland, at your kitchen table, at home. You know, my dad died a few years ago, and I often think back to those days, sitting with him and my mother and my siblings at that kitchen table, and I think if my kitchen table, if my childhood kitchen table could talk, the stories it could tell, it would talk about my father coming home after work and taking his adult education class stuff to try to learn English. He never did, by the way. We lied to him, like we could tell him we could understand him. He never learned English. It was there that I opened this big fat envelope from a school in the Midwest, and I was the first one to get accepted into college. And the table would tell you stories that would make you laugh and some that would break your heart, but it would never tell you stories of government censorship. because no government official ever sat at our kitchen table and censored what we said. My father would have fought mightily at that door to let anyone come into our house and tell him how to raise his own children. In this country of ours, no one gets to touch what's in our hearts and what's in our minds. No one. Tomorrow, when I return to Virginia, I will sit with my teenage kids at our own dented kitchen table, and I'll tell them a happy story. I'll tell them that I met this group of people in Denver that think like us. From breakfast with Tom and Barb this morning, to dinner with Anne and Will and so many great people, you love this country of ours as much as we do and as much as they do, and no government official will ever sit at your table or ours. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, good job. Good job. Thank you. Thank you.